Hello, and welcome to the podcast of the Gem State Substack. I'm your host, Brian Allman. Remember to visit gemstate.substack.com and subscribe. Free subscribers get multiple posts per week, and for the price of a cup of coffee each week, you can support my work and get exclusive and early access to articles, videos, and podcasts like this one. One thing that you can do that costs nothing but a few moments of your time is to share this platform. Share my Substack with your like-minded friends. Ask them to subscribe too. Share this podcast on your social media. Go give it a 5-star review on whatever platform you're listening on. I truly appreciate your help. A rhetorical bomb exploded this week in the Idaho legislature. The Idaho Freedom Caucus released 2 letters that were sent to its members by Chuck Winder, the Senate President pro tempore. That is, the most powerful senator in the chamber. Senator Glenita Zeiderveld was removed from her position as vice chair of the Health and Welfare Committee, and Winder also threatened both her and Senator Scott Herndon with ethics complaints. These letters were in response to newsletters sent out by Zeiderveld and Herndon. Glenita's, posted on her Substack, explained how conservative lawmakers are the Davids to Iaki's Goliath. IACI, the Idaho Association of Commerce and Industry, is essentially the lobbying and marketing arm of Idaho businesses. They promote legislation such as Governor Little's launch grant, which only passed last year with unanimous support from the Democrats, because it essentially funnels taxpayer money to their member corporations. Why pay to train your own workers when you can get the taxpayers to do it for you? It's a great return on the investment they make by donating to political figures such as Brad Little, Chuck Winder, and their associated PACs. This is the sort of cronyism that Senator Zeiderveld called out in her newsletter, and that's why Chuck Winder stripped her of her vice chairmanship. He seemed particularly annoyed that she included an AI-created image of him, Representative Stephanie Mickelson, and Senator Kevin Cook as rhinoceroses, literally carrying Iaki's water. For the political establishment in Idaho, Iaki is essentially their boss, and calling them out or mocking them is definitely not allowed. Winder doesn't mind when his favorites attack conservatives, of course. He stood idly by last session when Senator Mark Guthrie read his own press release on the Senate floor, attacking Brian Lenny as a California transplant. He and his friends regularly attack conservative lawmakers for scoring too high on the Idaho Freedom Index. He himself has used his bully pulpit to attack conservatives in Idaho, including the state Republican Party and its chair Dorothy Moon. It seems that Winder thinks attacking fellow Republicans is perfectly fine when he or his friends do it, but it's not allowed when the tables are turned. In other words, he can dish it out, but he can't take it, and he will use his authority as pro tem to punish anyone who crosses him. This sounds like the sort of central authority and machine politics that Republicans are supposed to oppose. Don't you dare cross Boss Winder or you'll get it. This isn't the first time that Winder's engaged in petty vindictiveness. Or is that vindictive pettiness? Last year, he retained his position as Senate President pro tem by the slimmest of margins, holding off a leadership challenge from Senator Lori Den Hartog. He immediately stripped Den Hartog of her committee chairmanship, demoting her for daring to challenge him. If a Democrat did it, I think everyone would call it what it was. There's another layer to this story, too. Several years ago, the Idaho legislature was considering a $6 million grant for a youth organization in Idaho. After Priscilla Giddings, then in the legislature, discovered that this organization was teaching children far-left ideologies regarding race and gender, she shined a light on the grant bill and convinced her colleagues to defeat it by 1 vote. When it came up again, they always do, the legislature attached a stipulation that said it could only be used for school-aged children. Well, the bureaucrats in the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare, who were tasked with distributing the money, they decided they knew better than the legislature and did what they wanted anyway. The fact that some of those bureaucrats were friends or even relations to the heads of the woke nonprofits probably had something to do with it. This malfeasance was revealed by none other than Senator Glenita Zeiderveld earlier this year when she shared a report from a whistleblower. This led to subpoenas from Attorney General Raul Labrador, who was then challenged with a lawsuit from IDHW in which they were represented by former legislator, failed Senate candidate, and establishment golden boy Greg Chaney. It also led to a third-party audit that found that IDHW was breaking all sorts of rules. Did Chuck Winder remove Zeiderveld as vice chair of the Health and Welfare Committee as payback for exposing malfeasance at IDHW? Maybe, maybe not, but it certainly raises questions, doesn't it? Unfortunately, a lot of old guard Republicans have circled the wagons around Winder and his cronies, attacking Zeiderveld and Herndon as malefactors, members of a parasitic faction that's tearing down the Republican brand. When I posted my story on this issue on Monday on social media, I got mostly positive feedback, but there were two detractors who really stood out. I debated whether or not to bring this up here on my platform, whether to name names, but I'm going to do it, because one, it demonstrates the mentality that we are fighting against, and two, both these men are semi-public figures who are engaging in debate on a public page. So, Mike Tomlin is the former chairman of Legislative District 14, of which I now serve as secretary. I've considered him a friend for more than 3 years, after he took me under his wing and introduced me to Idaho politics. Even though he seems to ideologically align with more conservative candidates, he is obsessive about the Republican brand and maintaining the status quo. He got pretty grumpy over my post, and the reaction of the Freedom Caucus to Senator Winder's letters. He seems to hate the fact that there's a group of Republicans who've banded together as a faction, and believes any reprimand of any such group is justified. If he has criticized the Main Street Caucus, I have not seen it. He got even grumpier when I posted a silly picture of the Leave Britney Alone guy and captioned it Leave Chuck Winder Alone. Mike thinks memes are childish, which I think really puts him out of touch with modern discourse. But in that, he is fairly representative of his generation. The baby boomers, once iconoclastic and willing to challenge authority, have become very stolid, very concerned when it's their sacred cows being slaughtered. Now, obviously, not all boomers are like that, but Mike Tomlin seems less concerned with principles than he is with appearances. Last session, when House Education Committee Chair Julie Yamamoto was engaged in very sneaky dealings behind the scenes to prevent certain bills from being heard, and even refused to allow explicit books that were found in local libraries to be read in her committee, some bomb-throwing conservatives mocked her, as is standard for political discourse today. He denounced these as awful attacks on a good Christian woman. It's the same thing with Chuck Winder. Because he presents himself as a nice old man, and because he goes to Bible study, and because he has a title, old guard Republicans like Mike Tomlin consider him beyond reproach. It doesn't matter how disrespectful Winder himself is, and it doesn't matter that he tolerates worse behavior from his own side. Old guard Republicans will circle the wagons to protect the establishment every time. Mike wants to present himself as above the fray, as being beyond factionalism, but he's chosen his side. He doesn't have a negative word to say about Chuck Winder or his ilk, but he constantly shoots toward the right. See, I don't mind sharp debate. I keep engaging with people like Trent Clark no matter what awful things he says about me, because at least he's upfront about who he is and what he believes. Unfortunately, Mike wants to have his cake and eat it too. The letter to Senator Scott Herndon was even more absurd than the one to Zeiderveld. Winder not only accused Scott of disrespecting his colleagues, but he said that he wasn't pulling his weight on JFAC, the Joint Finance Appropriations Committee. Now, from my vantage point at the Idaho Freedom Foundation last year, I can tell you that Scott was one of the two hardest working members of JFAC, along with my own representative, Josh Tanner. These two were consistently combing through every line of every budget trying to find ways to save taxpayer dollars or eliminate woke expenditures. Of course, Chuck Winder doesn't care about saving tax dollars or fighting the left-wing agenda. Like so many lawmakers and executives today, he thinks his job is to keep this system running. In this case, the system is a machine that moves tax dollars from you and me to bloated state agencies and big corporations that donate to Winder and his allies. Winder's accusation that Herndon only worked on one budget wasn't even accurate. In addition to combing through every budget, Herndon sponsored 5 such bills on the Senate floor. So did the pro tem lie? Or was he just being sloppy in an official reprimand? Either way, it's not a good look, but once again, the old guard doesn't care. To them, he's a shining example of a citizen legislator, a good Christian man who must not be questioned. The second person to react negatively to my post on Monday was Kelly Walton, who sits on the board of Idaho Chooses Life. I've been a little bit suspicious of ICL for a while because while they promote pro-life legislation, they also donate tremendous amounts of money to establishment politicians. Last year, they savagely attacked Priscilla Giddings in the race for lieutenant governor, calling her pro-abortion because she thought their bill was not pro-life enough. They donated money instead to her opponent, Scott Bedke. In any case, Kelly Walton himself is an arrogant little man, and his performance on Monday on social media takes the cake. He responded to my post by saying that I was incorrect, that Winder was absolutely in the right, and that Zeiderveld and Herndon were wrong. Now, I asked him if he actually read my article, because I pointed to examples of Winder being disrespectful himself, and Walton said, yes, I read it carefully. Now keep that in mind for this next part. After some back and forth, I really do enjoy the social media arena, he said, and I quote, "The real issue lies in your post. Winder is personally attacking that paragon of virtue, the Idaho Freedom Foundation. How dare he challenge the source of all wisdom that has an inerrant opinion for every bill that surfaces on every issue? Wayne Hoffman posts live on how to vote, no matter his experience level. Suspect, at best, in most areas, although he's quite good on some. There's a handful of legislators who will ignore their sacred duty to personally investigate and take wisdom from all quarters, and instead simply wait for Hoffman's latest edict to obey. My point? No one is that good on every issue. No one. To the extent that IFF is considered unassailable by a handful of gullible legislators, the organization needs a serious wake-up call." End quote. Now, if you, unlike Kelly Walton, actually read my essay, you can already see the problem here. You can see his mistake. I gave him a couple of chances to correct himself, urging him to go back and not only read it carefully, but press Ctrl F and search for the word foundation. But he mocked and belittled me instead. In his arrogance, this absolutely conceited belief that he cannot possibly be wrong, he didn't even realize that I never once brought up IFF in my essay. He even doubled down, saying in another post that, quote, "That IFF was the real target of Winder was the key point of your post. You really should remember what you wrote." End quote. I haven't worked for IFF for 2 months now, and in that time, I've hardly mentioned them. I've barely given them a second thought. They're doing their thing, I'm doing mine. You see, what happened is that Walton didn't actually read my essay carefully. Rather, he skimmed it to find points in which to argue. Maybe he needs new glasses, or maybe he was just being sloppy, but he apparently mistook Idaho Freedom Caucus for Idaho Freedom Foundation. Those are two entirely separate organizations with separate missions. Apparently, Wayne Hoffman and the IFF live so strongly in Walton's head that he can't see straight. I really don't mean to pile on here. I'm sure both men are nice in real life. I can definitely say that about Mike. He's a good guy in person. But they're providing such great examples for the problem with discourse on the right today. To them, details don't matter. Ideology barely matters. What is important is the existing power structure, the one they're familiar with, the one they've worked with, that it remain in power. They're more angry that Glenita Zeiderveld posted a silly meme of Chuck Winder looking like a rhinoceros than they are about Republicans who voted to keep pornographic materials in libraries, or Republicans who voted against banning transgender mutilation surgeries on children. They don't care one whit that JFAC continually rubber stamps ever-increasing state budgets, that we're bringing in massive amounts of federal money to supplement our state agencies, or that Governor Little is handing out tax dollars to his corporate friends. For them, this is all business as usual. But posting a meme calling Winder and his cronies what they are, that's wrong. That's disrespectful. I've not seen either man or any of their friends call out nonsense like the so-called Idaho Liberty PAC's attack on 3 great conservatives. This PAC recently dumped nearly $50,000 into a campaign against Senators Chris Trachel, Tammy Nichols, and Brian Lenny, printing literature that accused all 3 of them of being liberals. Now this is obviously absurd. The same people who say that Trachel, Nichols, and Lenny are far-right extremists now want you to believe that they're California-style liberals. All 3 door-hangers accused the senators of voting to defund police, defund prisons, and defund veterans' benefits. What they don't tell you is that the votes they reference were massive, bloated budget bills that members of the Freedom Caucus opposed. But this is what the spending addicts do, both at the state and national levels. They'll include one little line item that funds police or veterans or whatever, and when anyone votes against it, they'll accuse them of defunding the police, harming our veterans. It's so dishonest, but politics is a dirty business. What makes this more interesting, though, is that Tammy Nichols said something the other day. She appeared on the Freedom Bros podcast with Dustin Hurst and Greg Pruitt, and shared that she ran into a paid worker passing out these Idaho Liberty PAC door hangers. She engaged him in conversation after it was clear that he had no idea who she was. He had come from Utah to knock on doors and had no idea what was going on. According to Nichols, when she asked whose PAC this was, he said it was Governor Little's. Isn't that interesting? Now, I've heard rumors that Brad Little is ultimately behind the Idaho Liberty PAC, but of course a paper trail is hard to establish. These people are very adept at moving money around very quietly. So let's take a look. According to the Sunshine Report, Idaho Liberty PAC takes in tons of money from corporations and other PACs. For example, they pulled $70,000 from Melaleuca, Frank Vandersloot's company, but several $100,000 more dollars from another PAC called the Idaho Victory Fund. Now, Idaho Victory Fund moves tons of money around as well. In last year's primary campaign, they donated to a bunch of moderate or establishment Republicans, including Greg Cheney, Jim Guthrie, Jim Patrick, Jim Woodward, Mark Harris, Carl Crabtree, Jeff Agenbrod, Fred Martin, and of course, Scott Bedke and Brad Little himself. So who donates to the Idaho Victory Fund? Well, it's mostly big corporations and business leaders. However, nearly half of their $1 million war chest came from something called the Idaho Inaugural Committee. This committee only has one donation on record, and that's the $500,000 to the Idaho Victory Fund. Searching for the Idaho Inaugural Committee doesn't actually bring up much. However, there's another PAC called the Friends of Brad Little that uses the exact same post office in Boise. In fact, the original C1 filing of the Friends of Brad Little PAC in November of 2022, just after the general election, lists its original name as the Idaho Inaugural Committee. Clearly, the two entities are one and the same. This PAC takes in massive donations from individuals and corporations, including $10,000 from Micron, $10,000 from Regents, $10,000 from Mountain View Hospital, $10,000 from the Idaho Community Hospital, $10,000 from the Blue Cross of Idaho, and many tens and hundreds of thousands more. So let's connect these dots backwards. Big corporations, especially in the healthcare industry apparently, donate to a PAC that used to be called the Idaho Inaugural Committee, but was later renamed to the Friends of Brad Little. Of the nearly $800,000 taken in by this PAC, $500,000 went straight to the Idaho Victory Fund. The Idaho Victory Fund then gave several $100,000 to the Idaho Liberty PAC, which is now using that money to attack Senators Treacle, Nichols, and Lenny. So it turns out that the anonymous paid door knocker from Utah that ran into Tammy Nichols was probably right in calling it Brad Little's PAC, even if you have to jump through a few hoops to nail it down. Now, why did I spend this time connecting these dots? Because it's all part of the same story. Chuck Winder attacking Glenita and Scott is part of the same establishment antibody reaction as the PAC attacks on Tammy, Chris, and Brian. The Cause of Liberty scored major victories in 2022, defeating several old guard senators and replacing them with champions for liberty, like Glenita Zeiderfeld, Scott Herndon, Tammy Nichols, Chris Treacle, and Brian Lenny. That's not even to mention the election of Dorothy Moon as the chair of the Idaho Republican Party. The old guard establishment didn't like that at all, and they're utilizing all their money and all their tools to destroy these usurpers, these interlopers who are threatening what they see as their rightful hold on power. These separate attacks on conservative senators, if not directly coordinated, are definitely in synergy. They know what they're doing. It is therefore unsurprising that old guard figures like Mike Tomlin and Kelly Walton circled the wagons around Senator Winder. To them, no matter how disrespectful people like Winder act, no matter how much they abuse their authority, no matter how much they grow government or run cover for progressive ideologies, they must not be questioned, they must not be attacked, and most importantly, they must not be mocked. And they most certainly must not be mocked with memes. Well, let me tell you, that's not going to cut it anymore. The American people have a long-standing tradition of mocking the politically powerful. Remember that the Republican elephant and the Democratic donkey came from Thomas Nast's political cartoons in the late 19th century. In the 1920s and 30s, Will Rogers made himself a beloved figure by mocking the political establishment and its pretensions and poking fun at the system. In the 1830s, political cartoonists portrayed President Andrew Jackson as both a jackass and a pompous king. In the presidential election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson allegedly hired a journalist to call his opponent John Adams a, quote, hideous hermaphroditical character which has neither the force and firmness of a man nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman, end quote. So when you see establishment cheerleaders clutching their pearls because Senator Zeiderfeld posted a picture of rhinoceroses, make sure to mock their pretensions as well. Politics is a bare-knuckle boxing match, and appealing to sensibility and decorum is usually just cover for factionalism and partisanship. I've seen very few shrinking violets out there who truly lament memes and mockery on both sides. Most, like Walton and Tomlin, only go one way. My name is Brian Ullman, and this has been the podcast of the Gem State Substack. I'll see you next time.